It had been just over 72 hours now since the Soviet offensive had surged into the defensive positions situated around the outskirts of Smolensk, and it was clear from the flood of reinforcements rushing eastwards that the High Command had no intention of allowing the location to fall back into enemy hands. Feldwebel Wolf Eber and his platoon had spent the entirety of those long days travelling to and from the battlefront aboard the military train they had been made responsible for. Day and night, taking it in turns to snatch a little sleep as they did so, the small detachment had repeatedly rattled back and forth along the tracks between the cities of Minsk and Smolensk, ferrying thousands of war-weary troops up to the madness of the battlefield, before grimly evacuating the most severely wounded to the rear for urgent medical treatment. It was only now, as they waited patiently at the sidings outside of Smolensk, that they'd finally been given the opportunity to escape and stretch their legs. Having again checked his watch to confirm how long they had been waiting, Eber then looked up to ensure that none of his command had disappeared from sight, before allowing his gaze to then move up and down the length of the vehicle where they had been confined for the preceding 3 days. At the front of the train was an armoured carriage, to which a tank turret had been welded in the event the transport encountered any enemy armour. Then to the rear, an identical carriage had been topped off with an anti-aircraft emplacement, which could be depressed to cover the ground around the train, if needs be. It was from these 2 reinforced sanctuaries that Eber and his men would be expected to repel any enemy attack, a far safer position than any of their passengers. There was little else to distinguish the rest of the carriages from those to be found attached to any of the other aging locomotives that inhabited the Soviet rail network. A mixture of inhospitable cattle carts and decaying passenger carriages that had been stripped of their seating to make room for more soldiers to stand inside. Here and there, minimal efforts had been made to hammer thin sheets of armour plating across some of the more vulnerable spots, but not to any useful degree of coordination. The half-expected blare of a vehicle horn from somewhere behind him caused the sergeant to reflexively stub out what remained of the cigarette he'd been smoking. Seconds later, he'd raised one thumb and a forefinger to his mouth, the whistle he produced acting to recall the rest of his men back to the waiting train, before he wearily turned on his heel to discover what madness the field gendarmerie had decided to embroil him in, and just how it was going to affect his men. The corpulent NCO who unfolded himself from the front seat of the lorry presented as a walking advert for everything that was abhorrent about the military police, immediately barking orders at the waiting train guards, without first either introducing himself or offering any explanation as to why the delay had been enforced upon them. Eber's men had delighted in ignoring these breathlessly issued orders, watching on expectantly as their own supervisor instead engaged the speaker in a brief battle of wits. The police sergeant's demeanour had quickly progressed from bluster to outrage, and then sulky resentment as his opposite number had taken firm control of the encounter. Eber explaining that neither his men nor the train crew would do anything to assist the police escorts without an appropriate degree of civility. It was at this point that the 6 figures who'd been seated in the back of the lorry were unloaded, all the time under the watchful eyes of their great-coated guards. The gendarme sergeant, who had by now identified himself as Brüller, had theatrically related how the men were Fallschirmjäger who'd deserted from their unit, apparently spending a number of days attempting to negotiate their surrender to the enemy before being recaptured and returned to the German positions. They would be transported on the train back to Minsk, where they would be debriefed in detail about their brief time behind the Russian lines before being executed. Ignoring Brüller's excitable monologue, Eber surveyed the tattered, unusual mixture of uniform his new passengers were wearing with some curiosity. If these men were Fallschirmjäger, they were clearly no longer dressed as such, and the story seemed unlikely given the hardy reputation such elite airborne troops possessed. To Brüller's unconcealed rage, Eber walked purposefully across to the group, striking up a conversation with their leader, a tall and powerfully built sergeant by the name of Linz. The pair had shared a little small talk, as Eber's men ensured the rest of the paratroopers were provided with cigarettes and coffee, before herding them to a waiting carriage. Linz managing to relate during this brief period how he and his men had survived tours in both Belgium and France, before being transferred to the horrors of the Eastern Front. It was at this point that Brüller finally got his way, ensuring the sliding doors to the carriage that Linz and his men had been placed in were locked from the outside, before he and his own men had taken up positions in the carriages that were hitched up either side of the one carrying the paratroopers. The police sergeant clearly agitated by the short contact that Ebbe had forced with his prisoners, prior to their departure. As the train had rattled sedately along the same stretch of line he had by now travelled time and again, Ebbe found himself increasingly troubled by Brüller's account. From the look in his eyes and his general mannerisms, there had been nothing to suggest that Linz had committed anything to justify his imprisonment, and the fact that he and his men were so bizarrely attired also demanded some form of explanation, which Brüller's account had not provided. Ebbe had been wrestling the feeling the gendarmes were holding something from him when the track directly ahead of them had disintegrated under a thunderous detonation. Seconds later, as the driver of the locomotive that was pushing them had engaged the brakes, he and his men were thrown bodily from their seats onto the cold metal decking. No sooner had he struggled up to the nearest viewing slit, surveying the twisted metal mass that now blocked their path, than there was a second explosion, the anti-aircraft carriage to their rear briefly lifting up on its wheels, before disappearing in a haze of grey-black smoke, the soldiers inside screaming briefly before they perished. Ebbe was yelling orders when a hail of gunfire erupted from the neighbouring tree line, hammering against the carriage that he and the surviving guards inhabited, with multiple figures, dressed in a mixture of tattered Russian uniform and civilian clothing, running directly at the train, firing their weapons in a wild and uncontrolled manner. As the rate of fire impacting against the carriage's armoured hull increased in intensity, he yelled at the pair manning the turret to traverse their weapon, knowing deep in his heart it would likely do little to stop the attack, which appeared to involve no enemy armour, but hoping a shell or two might buy them some time to form a plan. When the anti-aircraft guns in the rear carriage destroyed, which would have provided a far greater deterrent, there was little else to be done. The moment that he and his men had so feared might occur was now taking place, directly around them. The ragged and sporadic fire produced by Ebbe and his men did little to deter the partisan attack, which had by now arrived at the main body of the train. Firing off another desperate volley in their direction, he could only watch on helplessly as the attackers began to pepper the wooden carriages with gunfire, before then hurling grenades and explosives in through the shattered windows, which acted to brutally curtail the screams of the wounded and dying inside. A sudden movement on the opposite side of the attack caught Ebbe's eye, and he watched on as Brüller and several of his men clambered out of their carriage, running for the tree line. None were successful, the partisans howling and whooping with delight as the fleeing policemen were cut down one at a time, before their inert bodies were further machine-gunned. Flinching briefly as the turret above rotated and discharged wildly into the surrounding trees, hitting nothing, Ebbe returned to his vantage point and shook his head in sorrow. A crowd of partisans had now assembled at the only carriage that remained undamaged by the attack, the bolted wagon which the captive Fallschirmjäger were imprisoned in. With a cry of rage he poked the barrel of his Schmeisser through his vantage point, firing off a wild burst at the group. This futile gesture dropped two of the attackers, and drew an irritated volley of return fire, but only seemed to embolden the partisans, who turned as one, and then emptied their own weapons directly through the bolted wooden doors into the carriage, roaring in triumph as they did so. Sinking back down to the ground, as the sound of the bullets ricocheted off the metal walls around him, Ebbe was consumed by a feeling of utter helplessness, no longer able to meet the questioning and desperate stares of the young men under his command, who had not yet accepted their fate. And then the screaming started. Hauling himself back up to the viewing slit, Ebbe watched on aghast as the door to the wooden carriage suddenly splintered outwards, the resultant debris felling several partisans, seemingly not because of any action taken by the attackers themselves, but as a result of something inside that had smashed its way clear. A pair of powerful limbs extended out through a gap in the damaged panels, hauling the heavy doors apart, before a dark shape launched itself at the men standing there. Around Ebbe there were gasps and expletives, as the men alongside him watched on in horror and wonder at the bloodshed that now ensued, at the towering monster, with its sharply clawed hands and powerful limbs, that were slashing and tearing away at the men that blocked its path. sinking its jaws into the torso of the resistance fighters and ripping chunks of their body loose, before twisting and snapping the limbs from their bodies. As it did so, the faint scraps of the patchwork uniform it had been wearing fell clear, revealing the muscles underneath and the thick pelt of dark-coloured fur that covered its body. Other moving figures now materialised from the interior of the shattered carriage behind the chaos of the rampaging monster. Ebba watched on as Lindsay's men emerged out into the daylight, quickly snatching up the weapons that had belonged to fallen partisans, instantly adopting firing positions and methodically downing those who were attempting to flee the carnage, before turning their attentions to the few who were still desperately engaged against the wolf-like creature before them. But of Linz himself there was no sign, only the 5 other paratroopers, still wearing their tattered uniforms, and the murderous creature battling to their front. Within moments it was all over, every one of the attackers either torn to pieces at the side of the train, or gunned down by the airborne troops using the weapons of their fallen comrades. Inside the surviving armoured train carriage, nobody spoke, all eyes instead fixed directly upon the monster that now stood panting breathlessly amidst the 5 Fallschirmjäger. As one of his men shakily raised their rifle up to a viewing port, either in a reflexive act of self-defence or to open fire, Ebba forcefully took hold of the barrel, hauling the weapon down, before rising to heave open the heavy steel door of the carriage and step down onto the muddy ground outside. Holding his weapon high up in the air for a moment, before then setting it down onto the ground, he began to walk slowly towards the group before him. In a heartbeat, all 5 of the men had their weapons turned and trained upon him, immediately forcing the approaching NCO to halt. What seemed like an eternity then passed, as the 2 parties cautiously regarded one another, as the nightmarish creature also turned to face him, performing an identical manoeuvre to the one he had just carried out, forcing down the barrel of the weapon held by the paratrooper stood nearest to it, before then leading the 5 paratroopers away from the carnage, each of whom gathered up weapons or uniform belonging to fallen partisans, and then disappeared off from view into the trees. As his men emerged silently behind him from the protection of their mobile fortress, Ebba regained his Schmeiser and walked cautiously along the length of the shattered train, arriving at the bloodied scene directly outside the broken cattle truck that the Fallschirmjäger had escaped from, before peering inside, half expecting to see the body of Sergeant Linz, broken and shattered by the bullets of the dead partisans, lying there. Instead, finding only the shredded remains of the uniform he had last seen the imposing NCO wearing, torn apart not by bullets, but as if by a great pressure or force that had been exerted upon them. Before he realised this was not time now to try and solve this mystery, his priority was instead to lead his men safely back to the nearest German positions, and then decide just how much of what had transpired could and should be told to their masters.